Welcome to week 4 of research methods. Hi again, I'm Miss Vahib, and today we will be going over some more non-experimental research methods. We're going to be looking at interviews and questionnaires, which are also known as self-report methods, and we will also be looking at how we analyse data through correlations and descriptive statistics. So, first we'll start off with understanding what self-report techniques are. So, self-report techniques are research methods in which participants give information about themselves without researcher interference. So, there are two self-report methods that we are going to look at today, and these are the two self-report methods that you need to know in depth for your psychology exam. So, first one we're going to look at is interviews, and the second one we are going to look at are questionnaires. Now, before we get into that, we need to understand the distinction between two types of data, qualitative and quantitative data. We often call data quantitative if it is in numerical form or can be easily analysed in numerical form, and qualitative if it is not numerical. So the self-report techniques that we are going to look at will either be quantitative or qualitative methods. Both types of data will have strengths and weaknesses which you will need to know. Qualitative data is expressed in words rather than numbers or statistics, whereas quantitative data is expressed in numerical form, and data can often be easily converted into graphs and charts. Right, so when we are designing a self-report measure, so when we are deciding how we will put our self-report measure together, so when we're designing our interviews or questionnaires, there are some things that we have to consider. The first one is we have to have a clear aim. Secondly, we've got to decide whether we want quantitative or qualitative data from our results. You can also have both. We need to consider then within that, are we using open or closed questions in our questionnaires? Don't worry, we'll come on to those in a minute. And are we using structured or unstructured interviews? And again, I'll explain the difference between them over on the next slide. So the first type of self-report method that we're going to look at are interviews. And interviews involve researchers asking face-to-face questions. Now, we've got two types of interviews you need to understand. The first one are structured interviews, and the second one, unstructured interviews. Right, so structured interviews are made up of predetermined set of questions that are asked in a fixed order. The interviewer asks questions and waits for a response. So often the questions are standardised, so it's pretty much a questionnaire that's delivered face-to-face or on the phone. However, unstructured interviews work more like a conversation. So there are no set questions really. There may be a general aim that the certain topic will be discussed, but interaction tends to be free and flowing. So the interviewee is encouraged to expand and elaborate on answers and is prompted by an interviewer. So as you can imagine, you would need a really experienced interviewer here to understand kind of what questions to follow on from and what questions to ask. Now, there are a few things that we need to take into consideration when we are designing a good interview. So the first thing we need to take into consideration is how we are going to record the interview. Now, an interviewer may take notes throughout the interview to document answers, but this is likely to interfere with their listening skills. It may also make the respondent feel a sense of evaluation because the interviewer may not write everything down, and then the respondent feels that what they said may not have been valuable. Alternatively, interviews may be audio recorded or video recorded. But as kind of you may think already, this also has its drawbacks. A respondent may feel uncomfortable being videoed and therefore show some unnatural behaviours or feel uncomfortable to divulge too much information. Now, there are some effects of the interviewer that we also need to take into consideration. Now, various behaviours such as sitting with arms crossed and frowning communicate disapproval and disinterest, whereas head nodding and leaning forward may encourage the respondent to speak. So, non-verbal communication is very important. Also, we need to consider listening skills. So an interviewer needs to be well trained in order to know when and how to speak. For example, they should not interrupt too often, and when they do speak, they should have a range of encouraging comments such as "how interesting" to show that they are listening. Now, in terms of the questioning skills in an unstructured interview, there are special skills to be learned about what kind of follow-up questions should be asked. So it's really important that we are aware of the questions already asked to avoid repeating them. It is also useful to avoid probing too much. For example, after asking someone what an experience was like, don't then say, "What was it really like?" It's also not helpful to ask why too often. It's better to ask more focused questions, both for the interviewee and also later for the analysis of answers. So the key here is training. In an unstructured interview, the interviewers need to be well trained and actually understand and know how to conduct the interview in this unstructured setting. Now, structured interviews. Strength of structured interviews is obviously that they are straightforward to replicate due to the standardized format. It also reduces differences between interviewers because there has been a standardized format. However, it is not possible for interviewers to deviate off topic and explore interesting points. It also stops interviewees from being able to elaborate on certain topics, which can be frustrating. And let's look at the evaluation now for unstructured interviews. So a strength of unstructured interviews is that they have more flexibility than a structured interview, as the interviewer can follow up points as they arise and explore interesting areas. However, there are a few weaknesses of unstructured interviews that you need to take into consideration. Firstly, the analysis of results or data from unstructured interviews are not simple. So due to this, there could potentially be quite a lot of information. So again, it could be hard to draw conclusions. Training the interviewers to conduct unstructured interviews can be quite long and expensive. And there may also be an element here of social desirability. However, a good interviewer should be able to build a good rapport so people are more likely to be truthful. So social desirability is a really key point that you need to know and understand when it comes to self-report methods. So social desirability bias is a distortion in the way people answer questions. They tend to answer questions in such a way that present themselves in a better light. Because let's face it, who wants to look bad when they're kind of answering questions in an interview, okay? Now, as you'll see as we move forward, social desirability is something that comes up quite a lot in self-report methods, not only in interviews, but also in questionnaires, which we're about to look at. So questionnaires are a set of written questions. They are designed to collect information about a topic or various topics. So questionnaires permit researchers to discover what people think or feel on the basis of how they behave. Questionnaires are always predetermined, so they are always structured, whereas an interview can be structured or unstructured. So we've had a look at how we design a good interview. Now it's really important that we look at how we design a good questionnaire. So we need to know the difference between open and closed questions. Open questions do not have a fixed range of answers, and respondents are free to answer in any way they wish. So open questions tend to produce qualitative data, rich in depth, however they are longer to analyse. So an example of an open question would be, why do you feel this way? Or why do you enjoy school? So we are encouraging respondents to ask or respond to the questions in any which way they want. Closed questions offer a fixed number of responses, for example, yes or no questions, or a rating from 1 to 10. Closed questions produce numerical data by limiting the answers the respondent can give. Quantitative data like this is usually easy to analyse, so that's a strength of quantitative data. But a problem with this kind of data is that it may lack the depth and detail associated with open questions. So we might not get a full understanding of why that respondent has answered in that particular. Now, there are different types of closed questions which you will eventually become familiar with. So a Likert scale could be used, which is where respondents indicate their agreement or otherwise with a statement using a scale of usually 5 points. So strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly agree. Rating scales are also used in types of closed questions. So they work similarly to Likert scales, but get respondents to identify a value that represents their strength of a feeling about a particular topic. For example, if we look at how entertaining do you find zombie films, there is a scale here from 1, very entertaining, to 5, not at all entertaining. And lastly, there are fixed choice options. So this is where there is a list of possible options and respondents are required to indicate those that apply to them. So for example, for what reasons do you watch zombie films? And then you have to tick the ones that apply. Problem with that is there is a chance that you are watching zombie films for another reason that isn't on there. So it may be good to offer open and closed questions together in a good questionnaire. Now, there are some important things to consider when you are writing questions in a questionnaire. Firstly, you need to avoid too much technical jargon. You need to keep the language quite simple so people know the answers or what is expected of them in their answer. You also need to avoid emotive language and leading questions. And you need to make the questions clear and concise so that the respondents are not confused about how to answer. When you're writing a questionnaire, it may also be important to include some irrelevant questions called filler questions to distract the respondent from the main purpose of the survey. This may reduce demand characteristics, so it may stop the the respondents from realizing what the questionnaire is truly about. Now, let's look at some strengths and weaknesses of questionnaires. So a strength of questionnaires is that they are cost effective. You can collect a large amount of data fairly quickly. The researcher doesn't need to be present, and also participants may be willing to share more information because it's often anonymous. However, weaknesses of questionnaires, the main weakness of questionnaires is social desirability bias. Now, respondents may not be truthful in the way they answer because they would like to be seen in a better light, and therefore this may change the validity of our results. And also, as you've seen, there are a lot of things that you need to consider when you are designing a questionnaire, and this can take quite a long time. Okay, so the next two topics we are going to skim over briefly. So we're going to look at correlations and measures of central tendency and dispersion. Your teacher will be going through these with you in more depth during the lesson. So let's first start with correlations. What are correlations? So they are the measurement of a relationship between two or more variables. Correlations are always represented using a scattergram. So the variables that are measured are known as covariables. So the covariables in the scenario we have got on the slide at the moment are aggression and caffeine. So we can see here that we are looking for a link between caffeine consumption and aggression. Now you need to know the difference between types of correlation. So in a positive correlation, the points lie close to a straight line which has a positive gradient. So in a positive correlation, as one variable increases, so does the other. Now in a negative correlation, the points lie close to a straight line, again, but it has a negative gradient. So it shows us that as one variable increases, the other decreases. And if, as seen here, there is no pattern to the points, that means we have a zero correlation. And this would suggest that there is no connection between the covariables. So we already know what a covariable is. So our covariables in the experiment on this current slide are aggression and caffeine, because they are the two variables we are interested in finding a link between. Now another key term you need to know is a correlation coefficient. A correlation coefficient is a numerical representation to demonstrate the relationship between two variables. Now, don't worry, we're going to go over that in more detail, but the key thing you need to take from this lesson is that a correlation does not mean a causation. So it is not telling us about a cause and effect, it's telling us about a relationship. So when we look at correlations in psychology, we cannot draw any definitive conclusions because they are just relationships. So we can't say that, for example, caffeine, an increase in caffeine causes an increase in aggression, because it's a mere correlation. So there may be a relationship between the two covariables, but it doesn't mean that there is a causal effect. Once a researcher has collected data in psychology, the data needs to be analysed in order to identify trends or see the bigger picture. Now, one of the ways to do this is by describing the data, for example, by giving an average score for a group of participants. So for this reason, such statistics are called descriptive statistics, as they identify general patterns and trends. Now, the two types of descriptive statistics we are going to look at today are measures of central tendency and measures of dispersion. Now, measures of central tendency are a type of descriptive statistic. They typically measure the average in a set of data. Central tendency, so measures of central tendency, look at what is happening in the middle of the data set. So they look at the middle numbers of a data set. And there are three different measures of central tendency. And you will have heard of these from GCSE Maths, but I'm going to go through them with you quickly just to refresh your minds. So they have the mean, median, and mode. Now, the mean is considered the average, and it uses all the different scores in a data set. So it can be affected by anomalies, so big or really small numbers in the data set. So for an example, to work out the mean of everybody's shoe size in your psychology class, you would add up all of the shoe sizes. So imagine your psychology classes were considerably smaller and you had 10 people in your psychology class. And we take each of their shoe sizes. So we've got a size 3, a 5, 9, 9, 8, 7, 6, 12, and 2 4s. First thing we'd need to do is add them all together. So 3 plus 5 plus 9 plus 9 plus 8, etc. And the answer to that would be 67. You then divide 67 by the total number of people in the psychology class, which was 10. So our answer is 6.7. So we have just found out the mean is 6.7, which is the average foot size in class. So let's understand a bit more about the median. Now the median is the middle value in a data set. We have to order, in order to work out the median, we have to order all the values from the data set from smallest to largest. If we have an odd number of participants, it's really easy. We just take the middle number once we've ordered it, and that is our median. However, if we have an even number, which we do in our kind of data set if we're looking at shoe size, then we have to do the following. So we take all of our shoe sizes and we place them in order. As you can see, the smallest is on the left and the largest is all the way on the right. We have two numbers in the middle at the moment, 6 and 7. So in order to work out the median in an even when we've got an even number of participants or data, what we need to do is add the two numbers in the middle. So in our case, it's 6 and 7, which equals 13. And then we simply divide 13 by 2. So our median in this case is 6.5. And lastly, our last measure of central tendency is the mode. Now, the mode is the most common value in a data set. So what we have to do is look at our data and see which number has the greatest frequency. So if we look at our data set, we can see that both 4 and 9 appear twice, which means that our data set is bimodal. Essentially, it has two modes. However, if we imagine that we only had one person with size 4 feet, it would mean that 9 would be our mode. Okay, so the mode is fairly simple to work out. It's just the number that appears most frequently in our data set. Now, measures of dispersion are another type of descriptive statistic. Measures of dispersion give us an indication of the spread of our data, so how spread out our data is. And the two types of measures of dispersion are the range and standard deviation. So again, you may have heard of these from GCSE maths. Now the range is the difference between your highest and lowest values. It's calculated by taking the smallest number away from the largest number in your data set. The range doesn't take central values in the data set into account, so it can be skewed by extremely high or extremely low values. Okay, so standard deviation. The standard deviation is another measure of dispersion, but this shows us to what extent the values in the data set deviate from the mean. So it tells us how spread out our data is from the mean. It is calculated by using every single one of the values in the data set, so it's argued to be more representative than the range. Now the good news is you don't ever have to work out the standard deviation in psychology. You just need to be able to interpret the numbers, so just understand what they mean, and we'll be going through that in class together. Right, so remember, we will go through all of the strengths and weaknesses of everything that we've gone through today, so measures of central tendency, measures of dispersion, and correlations during the lesson. So that's it for this year's research methods videos. We hope you've enjoyed them. You have still got a few topics outstanding, but you will do those in class with your teacher. Good luck with the rest of the research methods topics.